I took the contract because the rent on my scanner license was due, and because Corvo paid in advance, which nobody in this business does unless they're nervous about something. He called it a location and behavior assessment. Subject 114, flagged in the displaced persons registry 3 years back, currently working the filing desk in Archive Block 9 on the lower concourse of Kesson Station. He said she owed a debt to a client of his, an old transport lien nobody had bothered collecting until now. He wanted her habits, her exits, her routine. He wanted, eventually, a full identity confirmation, and he handed me a scanner pen that was heavier than it should have been and told me to get close enough to use it without her noticing. I've done this work long enough to know when a man is lying about the shape of a job, even when every word in it might be true. I watched her for 6 days before I did anything Corvo was paying me for. She came in before the shift board lit and left after it went dark, which told me she had nowhere she wanted to be more than that archive. She ate alone at the second table by the recycler vents. Always the second table, never the first, like she'd learned once that the first table belonged to someone else, and never unlearned it. She fixed the same stuck drawer on cabinet 4 every single morning, with the same 3 motions: heel of her hand, half turn, lift, before anyone else in the block was even through the door. Efficient, isolated. Nobody said good morning to her, and she didn't seem to expect it. She stood like she was used to a room turning to look at her, and then caught herself, and folded that down into something smaller. That was the tell that made me stop trusting Corvo. Debt collectors don't care how a person stands. I've surveilled a lot of people for a lot of reasons that turned out to be smaller and uglier than the client's opening pitch, and there's a rhythm to watching someone who's hiding something they did. A flinch at footsteps, eyes checking the exits before the door, hands too quick to explain themselves. She didn't have any of that. What she had was the opposite. The stillness of someone who'd already decided, a long time ago, that being caught wasn't the worst thing that could happen to her, and had built a whole quiet life around outlasting whatever came next, instead of running from it. I'd never surveilled anyone who was simply enduring before. It made the job feel wrong in a way I couldn't yet put a name to. On the 4th evening, I watched her stay 2 hours past close, alone under the archive's low emergency lighting, refiling a set of manifests that had already been filed correctly. She wasn't fixing an error. She was just staying somewhere no one would ask her to explain herself, because out on the concourse, apparently, someone always did. I logged it as extended presence, no stated cause, for Corvo's file, and then sat in my car outside the block a long time before I drove home, turning that lie of omission over in my hands like it might tell me something. On the 7th day I used the pen. I'm not going to make myself sound better than I am. I told myself it was just data, that I hadn't decided anything yet, that a scan was a smaller thing than a decision. I held it against the underside of the counter while she processed a stack of transit manifests, and it read her in 4 seconds and put a name on my slate that Corvo's client had clearly known and I hadn't. Ilith Seren, line of Corvain, presumed dead in the succession purge, 11 years gone. Not a debtor, an heir, filed under a debt case because a live claim is harder to leave alone than a corpse, and a great deal easier to make one of if nobody's looking. I sat with that a long time before I went back into the block. The next morning, I did the only thing I could think to do that wasn't filing a report and wasn't walking away. I brought a second chair to her desk, and I sat down in it at the second table, uninvited, and I put half my lunch across from her without asking if she wanted company. She looked at the chair, then at me, the way you'd look at a door that had opened on its own. "You're at the wrong table," she said, not unkind, just factual, like she was correcting an error on a manifest. "Contractor," I said. "Nobody's told me where the wrong table is yet." She didn't smile, but she didn't tell me to leave either, and the next day the chair was already pulled out when I got there, which was its own kind of answer. I kept coming. I never told her what the pen had found. I told myself I was giving her time to decide whether to trust a stranger with a slate and a scanner pen, but the truth was simpler. I liked sitting across from someone who fixed the same drawer every morning, like it was owed the same 3 motions regardless of whether anyone noticed. There's a dignity in that kind of care that doesn't ask permission to exist. It was the 11th day when Corvo called wanting his report. He was pleasant about it, which is how you know a man like that has already spent your answer before you've given it to him. He asked if the confirmation was clean. He asked, twice, whether the subject had any protection detail, any allies, anyone who'd notice if she stopped showing up to work. I understood, listening to the particular shape of those questions, that he already had a buyer lined up for whatever I confirmed. Not a lien, a location. Sold to whoever in the Corvain succession still had a use for making sure an heir with a legitimate claim never surfaced to complicate a settled inheritance. "You're overthinking a debt case," he said, when I went quiet too long. "Habit," I told him. "I'll have it to you by morning." I sat with the slate open in front of me most of that night, her name and her line sitting there in cold registry text, and I thought about every version of the report I could file that wouldn't end with someone knocking on an archive door at closing time. There wasn't one. The only version that kept her safe was the one where the file never existed at all. I told him the scan came back negative, false flag, wrong woman, some old registry error nobody had caught in 11 years. I told him to close the file, and I forfeited the second half of the fee, which is the closest thing to a confession I've ever made to a man like that, and if he understood it as one, he never said. I went and sat at the second table that evening after the shift board went dark, which I'd never done before, and she was still there, one hand resting flat on the drawer she'd already fixed once that day. "You know what I am," she said. Not a question. She'd known longer than I had, probably. People who've spent a decade disappearing learn to read a room before it reads them. "I know what you're not," I said. "You're not a debt. That's the only part that was ever mine to check." Her hand came off the drawer slow, like she was setting something down she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten the weight of it. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't let them spill, and I understood that not spilling was the point, that composure was the last thing she'd kept for herself, when everything else had a name filed under someone else's ledger, and she wasn't handing that over either, not even now. "They'll send someone else," she said. "They will," I said, "and I'll still be at this table when they do. I'm not a soldier. I don't carry anything sharper than a multi-tool, and I've never fought for a crown in my life. But I know what it looks like when a person decides, quietly, that they're done disappearing on someone else's schedule, and I watched it settle into her shoulders that evening. Not triumph, nothing that dramatic, just a straightening, the kind you do when you finally set a heavy case down and your back remembers what it used to feel like empty. She didn't leave the archive. She didn't need a fleet or a coronation or a room full of strangers falling to their knees. She needed one chair pulled out at a table where nobody had ever asked her name before, checking what it was worth, and she had that now, every morning, before the shift board lit. I still fix the drawer some mornings, when I get there early enough. Heel of the hand, half turn, lift. She lets me, now. It's a small thing. It's the only thing either of us ever actually agreed to. Corvo never called back. I like to think that means he believed me, though I suspect it means only that he found an easier heir to sell somewhere else. I don't check anymore. Some contracts you close by walking away from the money, and you don't go looking for what it cost you. I show up. That's the whole arrangement. 9 days out of 10, so does she, and the drawer sticks a little less than it used to, and neither one of us has ever needed to call it anything more than that.